There is a silence in history that most people never notice. Not the silence between events, not the pause between one war and the next, or the quiet years between the fall of one empire and the rise of another. This is a different kind of silence, a deliberate one, a silence that sits precisely where something enormous used to be. A silence that was built, carefully, methodically, over generations, to replace something that once made the whole world tremble with wonder. Somewhere between the 16th and 19th centuries, something happened. Something that the textbooks have never quite explained. Buildings appeared in cities across multiple continents. Not modest structures, not simple homes or ordinary civic halls, but vast, cathedral-like edifices with domes so perfectly proportioned they seemed to breathe. Columns so tall they made grown men feel like children standing at the foot of ancient trees. Arches so geometrically exact that modern engineers, armed with computers and laser measurement tools, have returned to study them and walked away more puzzled than when they arrived. And the official explanation for all of it, the one handed to us in textbooks, the one we have absorbed since childhood, is that it was all built in a matter of decades, by workers using hand tools, by civilizations that had never seen anything like it before, and who somehow, with no prior tradition, no accumulated architectural knowledge, no engineering apprenticeships passed down through generations, simply figured it out. So you are invited tonight to question that explanation, not with anger, not with urgency, but with the slow, careful attention of someone who has all the time in the world and who simply wants to look at things more carefully than they have ever been looked at before. This is the story of Tartaria, or rather, this is the story of what some researchers, historians, and independent thinkers believe Tartaria represents. It is the story of a possible civilization, vast, sophisticated, and cosmopolitan, that may have spanned much of the known world, that may have built structures still standing in your city right now, and that may have been deliberately erased from the historical record so completely that only a few clues remain, hidden in plain sight, embedded in the very architecture we walk past every single day without ever wondering where it truly came from. If you are someone who likes to let your mind drift while you listen, if you are someone who finds the deepest sleep in stories of mystery and wonder, if you are someone who has looked at an old building in your city and felt, without knowing why, that it was older than anyone was telling you, then you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave this playing as you settle in. Let the questions come without the need for answers tonight, because that is how the most interesting parts of the mind wake up, right on the threshold of sleep, when the usual noise has finally gone quiet. Breathe slowly. Let's begin. The world before the world, we know there is a map. It was printed in Europe in 1570, created by a Flemish cartographer named Abraham Ortelius. It is considered one of the first modern atlases. It is considered a foundational document of Western geography. And in the upper right corner of that map, spanning a territory so immense that it swallows half of Asia and reaches fingers toward Europe, is a single label, Tartaria, or sometimes Tartari. The spelling shifts across documents, across centuries, across languages, but the presence remains constant. The thing being named remains constant. A vast territory, acknowledged by the mapmakers of the 16th and 17th centuries, labelled with the same matter-of-fact confidence that they used to label France or Spain or the Ottoman Empire. And then, somewhere in the 19th century, it disappears. Not gradually, not in the way that empires usually dissolve, slowly losing territory to neighbours, contracting over generations, their name growing smaller on successive maps until it finally vanishes. It disappears all at once, like a word erased from a sentence, like a chapter torn from a book, like a name that someone very powerful decided should no longer be spoken. If you search the major encyclopedias of the 18th century, you will find Tartaria. The Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1771 devotes substantial entries to it. It describes different regions of Tartaria: independent Tartari, Chinese Tartari, Russian Tartari, Tibetan Tartari. It describes the people, the customs, the geography. It describes Tartaria as a real, existing, well-documented place. By the mid-19th century, it is gone from the encyclopedias. The entries simply stop. The territory, once so vast that cartographers couldn't ignore it, has been redistributed between Russia and China and a scattering of other nation-states. The name itself has been reclassified as an archaic European misunderstanding of Central Asian geography. The official explanation is clean and simple. Tartaria was never a real unified civilization. It was a loose, poorly understood geographic term used by medieval Europeans to describe the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe. It was a label, not an empire, a geographical convenience, not a state. And yet the maps keep showing structures. The historical records keep mentioning cities. The travelers who journeyed through the Tartarian territories keep writing about roads and architecture and centers of trade that would be impressive by any standard, in any era. And then there is the architecture. That is where this story truly begins to breathe. The buildings that time forgot to explain. Walk through the center of almost any major Western city, and you will find them, buildings that seem to belong to a different world than the one that allegedly built them. In Washington, D.C., which was supposedly carved out of wilderness in the late 18th century, which was supposedly a mosquito-filled swamp on the banks of the Potomac when the American experiment was just beginning, you will find buildings of such extraordinary scale and sophistication that they seem to require centuries of accumulated architectural mastery. The Capitol, the Treasury, the Library of Congress, the old post office. Domed, colonnaded, vast, decorated with the kind of intricate stonework that takes not years but generations to master. In Chicago, which was in 1830, a trading post with fewer than 100 permanent residents, and which by 1893 was hosting the world's Columbian Exposition, you will find something that stops the careful observer cold. Because the White City, as that exposition came to be known, was a collection of enormous, ornate, classically styled buildings of such astonishing quality that visitors from around the world came specifically to see them. 14 main buildings, constructed, according to the official record, in 2 years, by a workforce that supposedly had no prior tradition of buildings on this scale. And then, this is the part worth sitting with, almost entirely demolished when the exposition was over. Almost entirely demolished. Researchers who have returned to study the photographs of the 1893 World's Fair have pointed out that the construction methods visible in those images do not clearly match the story of rapid temporary construction that we have been told. The building materials look like stone. They look like cast architectural elements, the kind that come from established manufacturing traditions, from facilities that already existed before any single exposition was planned. The scale of the interior spaces, visible in photographs and contemporary accounts, would be extraordinary for any era, let alone for supposedly temporary structures built by a young, industrially adolescent civilization. And this pattern, the appearance of impossibly sophisticated buildings in places where there should be no tradition to support them, repeats itself in city after city, country after country, continent after continent. In St. Petersburg, which Peter the Great supposedly built from scratch in swampy lowlands, beginning in 1703, you find a city that looks like it was not built, but uncovered. The scale of the Winter Palace alone, the Hermitage, the canals that run with such geometric precision through the city's center, the facades of buildings that line entire boulevards in perfect, coordinated classical harmony. The idea that all of this was designed, funded, staffed, supplied, and constructed within a century or two of an autocrat's decision to build a new capital city strains the imagination, if you stop and really let it. In Buenos Aires, in Melbourne, in cities across South America and Australia that were, by official record, frontier settlements within living memory of the buildings still standing in their historic centres. What, exactly, are we looking at when we look at these buildings? The Tartaria researchers say we are looking at the remnants of the previous world. We are looking at the construction legacy of a civilization that had been building on this scale for centuries before the history books begin. A civilization that developed architectural traditions, engineering methods, and aesthetic sensibilities over a span of time that official history has simply chosen not to account for. And when that civilization disappeared, however it disappeared, whether through catastrophe or conquest or a process of managed erasure, their buildings remained. And the new powers that rose to fill the vacuum simply moved in, claimed the buildings as their own, invented histories to explain them, and hoped that no one would look too closely. It is a theory, it is speculation. The researchers who explore it are quick, when pressed, to acknowledge the boundaries of what they can prove. But the buildings are there, and the explanations for them are, at minimum, worth examining with patience and care. The maps that keep appearing. If the Tartaria hypothesis rested only on architecture, it would be interesting but unstable. Architecture can be misread. Scale can be deceiving. The same skeptical energy that makes us question the official story can sometimes run too fast. But the maps are harder to dismiss. For several hundred years, European cartographers drew Tartaria. Not always consistently, not always with the same borders, but always with the same acknowledgement. Something was there, something large enough to be named, something whose existence was so self-evident to the educated people of those centuries that it would no more have occurred to them to omit it from a map than it would occur to a modern mapmaker to leave off Russia or China. The maps of Gerardus Mercator, the maps of Joan Bleu, the maps published in the great Dutch atlas collections of the 17th century, which were considered the most authoritative geographical references of their era. All of them showed Tartaria. All of them label it. All of them, in their margin notes and accompanying texts, describe it as a real place with a real population and a real historical and cultural identity. What the maps do not always agree on is the precise nature of Tartaria's governance. Some show it as a single empire, some divide it into regions, some describe a great capital, others focus on the geographical expanse without specifying political structure. And researchers who spend time with these maps point out that this disagreement is itself interesting, because it suggests that the European cartographers were trying to describe something real and complex that they were receiving information about secondhand, filtering through imperfect channels of trade and diplomacy and travel narrative, and doing their best to represent accurately without always having complete information. That is how you map a real, distant place. That is not how you map a fiction. And yet, between approximately 1800 and 1900, these maps stop. The cartographic tradition of labeling Tartaria simply ends. The territory gets absorbed into other labels. The spaces on maps that used to say Tartaria now say Russia, or Central Asia, or simply nothing at all. And the explanation offered by mainstream historians, Baduksadins, that Tartaria was always just a vague geographic concept and that 19th century cartographers simply became more precise, does not quite account for the speed and completeness of the transition. Because precision in cartography usually adds detail. It narrows and refines. It does not make large, well-documented labels simply disappear. What makes a word disappear is not greater accuracy. What makes a word disappear is a decision. There is also the curious case of the 1831 encyclopedia. Researchers studying pre-1850 reference materials have noted that certain encyclopedias from this period, particularly Russian and European ones, contain entries for Tartaria that go significantly beyond vague geographic description. They describe systems of governance. They describe cities with names. They describe a culture with its own distinct aesthetic traditions that researchers have then compared to the architectural styles of buildings in cities that were supposedly built by entirely different civilizations and found uncomfortable degrees of similarity. The mud floor of history is deep, and the older you dig, the more you find that doesn't quite match the surface story. The mud flood theory. This is the part of the Tartaria hypothesis that many people find the most viscerally arresting, and it is the part that requires the most careful, patient attention. Not because it demands more credulity, but because it asks us to look at something we walk past every single day and ask a question we have never thought to ask. Why are so many old buildings partially underground? Walk through the historic center of an old European or American city. Go to the buildings that are described as originating in the 18th century or earlier. Look at their facades. Look at where the ground meets the walls. And notice, if you haven't noticed before, that the windows of what are described as basement levels are often not basement windows at all. They are windows that were clearly designed when they were built to be at ground level. Windows with the proportions and decorative treatment of first-floor windows. Windows that look out now at eye level with the actual ground, or even slightly below it, as if the ground has risen around the building over time. This is not a rare observation. It is something that researchers studying this question have documented in city after city. Buildings where the current street level is demonstrably higher than the original street level. Buildings where entire stories have been subsumed by accumulated earth. Buildings with ornate architectural details below the modern ground line, visible only if you venture into what are now called basements or subterranean storage areas, where carved columns and decorated ceilings tell you, silently and unmistakably, that these were once interior rooms that someone lived and worked in, not underground chambers. The mud flood theory proposes an explanation for this. It proposes that at some point in the recent past, not in the deep geological past, but within the last 300 to 500 years, something happened that buried significant portions of existing civilization under an enormous quantity of earth. Whether this was a catastrophic geological event, an extraordinary meteorological phenomenon, a series of devastating floods, or some combination of multiple disasters, the theory suggests that the result was a rapid accumulation of sediment that partially buried existing cities, preserved the upper stories of existing buildings, and left subsequent generations with a world that looked partially destroyed and partially intact. The subsequent generations, the ones who arrived after whatever the event was, then built on top. They incorporated the surviving upper stories of buried buildings into their new construction. They used the partially submerged structures as foundations. They dug out some of the ground floors for storage, and they either genuinely did not know what had been there before, or they knew and did not tell anyone. Researchers who explore this theory have pointed to what they describe as telling anomalies in the historical record of certain cities. In Philadelphia, for example, researchers have noted that certain old buildings in the historic district have architectural details and proportional systems that seem inconsistent with their documented construction dates. Some of the oldest visible buildings in the city have ground floor features that architectural historians have noted seem unusually ornate for the period and for a young colonial settlement. In Moscow, the Kremlin itself, which is described in official history as a structure built and expanded over several centuries of Russian history, has been the subject of alternative analysis, suggesting that certain foundational elements of the complex may be significantly older than the documented construction phases. In cities across Europe, researchers have noted that excavations regularly reveal building foundations and even intact structures below the existing street level. Structures that date to periods that are not always clearly consistent with what official history says should be there. The mainstream explanation for buildings sitting below street level is usually one of two things: deliberate urban fill, where cities intentionally raise street levels to improve drainage or accommodate expanding infrastructure, or gradual accumulation, the slow geological and urban process by which streets naturally rise over centuries as debris accumulates. Both explanations are real phenomena. Both happen. Neither is impossible. But researchers who have looked at this carefully note that the degree of burial in certain cities seems too extensive and too rapid for gradual accumulation alone to explain. And deliberate urban fill, while it certainly happened in places, would be a massive, documented, resource-intensive undertaking that would leave substantial records, and those records are not always present. What the mud flood theory is really asking is this: is it possible that we are living, right now, in the upper floors of a civilization that we don't remember? Is it possible that the ground we walk on is not the original surface of this world, but a layer, several feet, sometimes 10, sometimes 20 feet thick, of material that settled over something that existed before? It is a question that invites you to see the city you live in differently, to look at the buildings around you and ask not just when they were built, but what was there before them, what was under them, what might be under them still. The star forts. There is a type of structure that appears, with extraordinary regularity, across an enormous geographic range. Star forts. You have perhaps seen them on maps or aerial photographs. Their shape is immediately recognizable. A central fortified area from which extend pointed bastions in a regular star pattern, creating interlocking fields of fire that theoretically eliminate blind spots and allow defenders to cover every approach. They appear in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, in Africa, in places that, by any reasonable historical accounting, should not have been in contact with each other at the period when these structures were supposedly built, and they are almost always attributed to the military engineering traditions of the early modern European period, the 16th and 17th centuries, when advances in gunpowder artillery supposedly made traditional vertical walls obsolete and prompted a revolution in defensive architecture. The star fort, also called the trace Italian in military architecture, is understood by mainstream historians as a European invention that spread globally with European colonialism. When you see a star fort in India, in Indonesia, in the Americas, you are supposedly seeing evidence of European colonial presence. When you see one in a city that has deep pre-colonial roots, the explanation is that it was either built by colonial powers or built by indigenous rulers who learned from European advisors. Tartaria researchers have approached star forts differently. They have noted that the distribution of star forts globally is in some cases difficult to explain purely by European colonial diffusion. They have noted that certain star forts appear in locations and contexts that are harder to account for within the standard narrative, and they have raised the possibility that the star fort shape is not an invention, but a rediscovery, or perhaps a preservation, of a much older architectural tradition, one that originated not in Renaissance Italy, but in whatever civilization built the world before the world we know. The geometric precision of star forts is notable. Their construction requires a sophisticated understanding of trigonometry, geometry, and site engineering. Their military logic requires a sophisticated understanding of ballistics and defensive strategy. They are not the structures of a civilization that is just beginning to think about these problems. They are the structures of a civilization that has been thinking about these problems for a very long time. Researchers have also noted that many star forts, when examined closely, show signs of construction in multiple distinct phases. where the foundational elements appear to use different materials and construction techniques than the later elements. In some cases, the foundational layers have been described by analysts as suggesting a different, earlier construction tradition than the upper or outer elements that are more typically attributed to known European engineering periods. Whether this represents construction by a previous civilization or simply the normal practice of building and rebuilding military structures over time is genuinely contested. The evidence is ambiguous. The reading of the evidence depends, to a significant degree, on what questions you start with. But the star forts are real, their distribution is real, and their precision is real. And if you want to lie awake tonight or drift toward sleep, imagining an earlier world that thought carefully about defense and geometry and the protection of what it had built, then the star forts are an excellent place to let your imagination settle. Because whatever built them knew exactly what it was doing. The free energy towers. This is where the Tartaria hypothesis intersects with another name most people know: Nikola Tesla. Tesla, the Serbian-American inventor who gave the modern world alternating current, who held hundreds of patents, who worked for and then broke from Thomas Edison, who spent the later years of his life in increasingly eccentric and visionary directions, has become a kind of patron saint of the alternative history community, and specifically of the Tartaria community. The connection is the towers, not just Wardenclyffe Tower, the unfinished structure that Tesla built on Long Island in the early 20th century, with the backing of J.P. Morgan, and that was supposed to transmit wireless electrical power across the Atlantic. Not just that tower, though that tower is extraordinary and deserves its own careful attention. The connection is to a certain class of architectural structure that appears, with considerable frequency, in the historic photographs of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Towers and building elements characterized by specific shapes. Onion domes, minarets with distinctive proportional systems, rounded, turret-like structures with specific geometric relationships between their height and their base, structures that researchers have argued could function as resonant antennas for the transmission or reception of atmospheric electrical energy. The suggestion is this: what if Wardenclyffe Tower was not an original invention? What if Tesla, who had a well-documented belief in the presence of electrical energy in the atmosphere and who spent much of his career trying to find ways to tap and transmit that energy, was not discovering something new, but rediscovering something old? What if the structures built by the civilization that Tartaria researchers describe, the ones visible in those buildings with their specific dome shapes and their specific turret proportions and their specific architectural vocabularies, were not decorative? What if they were functional? What if the most beautiful architectural period in recent Western history was also a period of free energy? The idea here is that the Tartarian civilization, whatever it was and wherever it came from, had developed a system of atmospheric electrical energy transmission, that the distinctive architectural features of their buildings, the domes, the spires, the turrets, the specific proportional systems, were not aesthetic choices, but engineering choices, that these structures were built the way they were built, because that shape was the one that most efficiently either generated, transmitted, or received electrical energy from the atmosphere, and that when the civilization was ended, whatever ended it, this energy system ended with it, and what remained were the buildings, stripped of their function, repurposed, inhabited by people who admired their beauty without understanding their engineering. Tesla, in this reading, stumbled back toward the truth. He intuited something that the Tartarian engineers had known. He began to rebuild their system. And then he was stopped. Morgan, his patron, famously withdrew funding from Wardenclyffe when it became clear that the technology Tesla was developing could not be metered, could not be sold, unit by unit, to consumers the way coal-generated electricity could be. And without metering, there was no business model. Without a business model, there was no funding. Wardenclyffe Tower was demolished in 1917, sold for scrap metal during the First World War. And the free energy system, if it ever existed, remained buried. Under the story, we tell ourselves about where our power comes from and who controls it. The orphan trains. There is a piece of American history from the mid-19th century that has always sat uncomfortably in the national narrative. Between approximately 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 children were transported from the East Coast cities of the United States to rural areas across the country on what became known as the orphan trains. The official history of the orphan trains is largely a story of well-intentioned social reformers trying to address the enormous problem of urban child poverty in the rapidly industrializing cities of the eastern seaboard. New York, in particular, had become severely overcrowded in the decades following the Irish immigration wave of the 1840s, and its streets were filled with homeless children, children without parents or with parents too impoverished or incapacitated to care for them. Charles Loring Brace, a Protestant minister, founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853, and the orphan trains were largely his project, a scheme to relocate these children from the dangerous, overcrowded cities to the supposedly healthier, more wholesome rural environment of the Midwest and West, where they could be placed with farming families who needed laborers. It is presented as a humanitarian story, albeit a complicated one. Children were placed, sometimes with loving families, sometimes with families who wanted nothing more than an unpaid farmhand. Their identities were often changed. Their previous histories were frequently lost or suppressed. They were placed as young as toddler age and expected to integrate completely into their new environments, which usually meant losing all connection to whatever they had been before. The Tartaria researchers look at the orphan trains and ask a different question. They ask, where exactly did all of these children come from? The official answer, urban poverty, is plausible for some of the children, perhaps many of them. Urban poverty was real. Child homelessness was real. The social conditions of 19th century American cities were, by any measure, brutal. But the scale of the orphan train program, 200,000 children over 75 years, the systematic nature of it, the way in which the process consistently separated children from any prior identity, the fact that the receiving families were explicitly encouraged not to inquire too deeply into the children's backgrounds, the way the records were kept or not kept. These details prompt a different reading. What if, researchers ask, some significant portion of those children were not the products of ordinary urban poverty? What if they were the survivors of something? What if the population that existed in North America before whatever transition happened in the 19th century, the population that supposedly lived in all those cities and built all those buildings, what if that population was reduced by whatever event it was that the mudflood theory and the Tartaria reset theory describe to a scattering of orphaned children? And what if the orphan trains were the administrative mechanism by which those children were quietly absorbed into the new population, their origins obscured, their memories of the previous world allowed to fade with childhood? This is, to be clear, deeply speculative. The researchers who raise this possibility acknowledge that there are many steps between the evidence and the conclusion, and that alternative explanations for every piece of evidence are available. But it is also, if you let it settle in the quiet of the night, a story with a certain terrible coherence. A world that ended, a generation of children who survived it and didn't fully understand what they had survived, an administrative system that moved those children quietly into new lives, where they would grow up without the knowledge or the language to describe what the world had been before, and a history that we inherited from those children a history with a gap at its center, a missing 300 years, a silence where something enormous used to be. The reset theory. At the heart of the Tartaria hypothesis, holding it together, giving it a structure that makes all the individual pieces cohere, is what researchers in this community call the reset theory. The idea is deceptively simple. Civilizations do not end gradually. They do not decline in the slow, dignified way that academic historians describe, with long periods of political fragmentation, followed by cultural absorption, followed by archaeological recovery. At least, not always. Sometimes a civilization ends catastrophically, abruptly, in a way that leaves very little evidence, because the mechanism of the ending itself destroys the evidence. And in the wake of that catastrophic ending, a new order rises, a new power, a new story, a new history. The reset theory, as applied to Tartaria, suggests that what we call modernity, the post-Enlightenment world of nation-states and industrial capitalism and Western colonial expansion, is not the natural development of human civilization. It is the specific cultural and political architecture of the civilization that won the reset. The civilization that, when the catastrophic event occurred that ended the Tartarian world, was positioned to fill the vacuum. The civilization that had the resources, the organization, and the will to not only move into the abandoned or depopulated territories, but to control the story of what had happened. And the most important part of controlling that story was controlling what was written down. The 19th century was an era of extraordinary archival activity. Museums were founded, libraries were organized, historical societies were established, archives were catalogued, academic disciplines were professionalized. The writing of history was systematized in ways it had never been systematized before, and this systematization, researchers note, happened to occur right at the period when the evidence for Tartaria was most vulnerable to erasure. Old maps were reclassified as curiosities. Old encyclopedias were superseded by newer ones that did not include the Tartaria entries. Old buildings were given new histories. Old photographs, and the mid-19th century, was precisely the period when photography was first being used to document the world. Old photographs showed buildings and cities that needed explaining, and the explanations were provided. This building was constructed in such and such year by such and such architect, commissioned by such and such ruler. The documents that supported these explanations were created, the documents were filed, the story was settled, and then everyone alive who remembered anything different was old enough that their memories were beginning to fade, and then they were dead, and then there was only the story. There is a useful parallel here with other historical moments we accept without question. We know that the winners of wars write history. We accept this as a truism. We understand that the version of events preserved in archives and textbooks is often the version that served the interests of whoever held power when the records were created. We understand this when we apply it to events like the colonial encounter, or the aftermath of specific wars, or the suppression of indigenous historical narratives. The Tartaria hypothesis asks us to apply this same understanding to a larger scale, to a global event, to a transition so complete that the winners didn't just write the history. They also, in effect, wrote the architecture, wrote the urban planning, wrote the very physical environment that subsequent generations would inhabit and take for granted. And the 300 years that the title of this video mentions, the missing 300 years, are not necessarily 300 years of Tartaria's existence that were hidden. They are 300 years of transition. The period between when Tartaria was real and present and functioning and well documented, and the period when it had been completely absorbed, its buildings repurposed, its people either eliminated or assimilated, its story replaced. The reset is not a moment, it is a process. And if the Tartaria researchers are right, it is a process that has happened before. and may happen again. The architecture speaks. There is a building in Paris that the official history says was begun in 1757 and completed in 1790. The Pantheon. If you have ever stood in front of it or inside it, or even just looked at it in photographs, you will know that it is extraordinary. A massive neoclassical structure with a colonnaded porch reminiscent of the Greek and Roman temples that preceded it by 2,000 years. An enormous dome that seems to float above the city's skyline. An interior of such proportional perfection that architects still study it as a masterwork of spatial design. The official story says it was designed by Jacques-Germain Soufflot, a French architect. It says it was built by the labor force of 18th century Paris, using the tools and methods of that era. It says the construction took 33 years and required significant engineering innovation to complete. None of this is necessarily wrong. Official histories often contain accurate information. The people named in them were real. The dates given are often verifiable by multiple independent sources. But Tartaria researchers note something that the official story doesn't fully explain. The Pantheon's proportional system, its geometric relationships, its specific technical features are in many ways indistinguishable from a much older architectural tradition. A tradition that predates the Renaissance, that predates the conscious European effort to revive classical Greek and Roman forms, and that appears, with striking consistency, in buildings across a range of cultures and geographies that supposedly had no connection to each other. The same proportional system appears in the great Islamic architecture of Central Asia, in the monumental architecture of certain Indian temple complexes, in the civic buildings of specific pre-Columbian cities, in structures attributed to civilizations that supposedly developed entirely independently, with no shared tradition and no contact. If these proportional systems were independently invented, we might chalk it up to the remarkable tendency of human minds, regardless of culture, to discover similar mathematical relationships and find them beautiful. But the degree of similarity goes beyond proportion. It extends to specific technical choices, specific engineering solutions, specific decorative vocabularies. Things that are not simply the product of human aesthetic universals, but that look with uncomfortable specificity, like shared training, like shared knowledge, like the products of a single tradition of building that was distributed across a much larger area than official history accounts for. This is the architectural argument for Tartaria in its most focused form. Not just that the buildings are too grand to have been built so quickly, not just that the cities seem too established to have sprung from wilderness, but that the buildings in cities thousands of miles apart share specific design DNA that has no adequate explanation within the official historical framework of separate, independent civilizational development. Something taught the whole world to build the same way. Something that reached from Central Asia to Western Europe to the Americas. Something that had a specific aesthetic, a specific engineering tradition, a specific relationship to geometry and proportion and the way that space should feel to the human body. And then something ended it. The libraries that burned one of the consistent features of civilizational transitions, real, documented ones, the kind that appear in official history, is the destruction of libraries. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, was destroyed in the ancient period. Exactly when, and by whom, and how completely it was destroyed, is itself a matter of historical debate, which is telling. Even in cases we do acknowledge, the evidence is fragmented and contested. But the general fact of the destruction and of the loss of enormous quantities of knowledge is accepted. The burning of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad in 1258, when the Mongol forces of Hulagu Khan sacked the city and threw the contents of its library into the Tigris River, which the contemporary sources say ran black with ink for days. an enormous loss of Islamic scholarship, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, the systematic destruction of Mesoamerican codices by Spanish colonial authorities and religious figures in the 16th century. Most of the Maya codices, the bark paper books that encoded centuries of Maya history, astronomy, ritual, and political memory, were burned on the orders of Bishop Diego de Landa. He later expressed regret. The codices did not return. These are accepted historical facts. We acknowledge them as tragedies. We understand that civilizational transitions, particularly violent ones, involve the deliberate destruction of the previous civilization's knowledge records. And yet, when Tartaria researchers suggest that a similar process may have occurred in the 19th century, on a global scale, the response from mainstream history is reflexive dismissal. But consider, if a global civilization was ending, or being ended, in the 18th and 19th centuries, and if the powers that were replacing it were engaged in a project of historical redefinition, what would they do with the libraries? What would they do with the archives? What would they do with the records that clearly stated what the previous world had been? Some of them they might destroy. Some of them they might reclassify, change the labels, mark as allegory or mythology or the confused impressions of pre-scientific observers. Some of them they might simply allow to sit in storage, unfunded, unexamined, slowly deteriorating, until the people who might have read them with the right eyes were gone, and new generations arrived who were trained from birth to not ask the right questions. The deliberate destruction of knowledge is easy to acknowledge when it happened in the deep past, or in a culture clearly other to our own. It is much harder to acknowledge when it might have happened in what feels like the recent past, in our own cultural tradition, by people whose descendants we have been taught to admire. But the evidence of loss is there, in the history of what certain archives contain and what they don't contain, in the curious gaps in certain documentary records, in the presence of buildings that are described in documents of one era and absent from the documents of the next, and in the silence that sits at the center of the official historical narrative when it encounters these gaps and says simply, "We don't know. We lost the records. The records weren't kept. The period is poorly documented. Those silences are not neutral. They are the shape of something that was there and is no longer." And sometimes, at the edge of sleep, in the particular clarity that comes when the conscious mind is finally ready to let go of its insistence on comfortable explanations, you can almost hear what used to fill them. The Romanov connection. Russia, in the Tartaria hypothesis, occupies a particular place. The territory that modern maps label as Russia, and before that, the Russian Empire, and before that, the Grand Duchy of Moscow and the various Rus principalities, overlaps significantly with the territory that older maps labeled as Tartaria. The steppelands, the vast interior, the enormous distances between the settled centers and the frontiers that seem to recede endlessly eastward. And the Romanov dynasty, which came to power in Russia in 1613 and ruled until the revolution of 1917, has attracted particular attention from Tartaria researchers. The official history of the Romanovs is well documented, a noble family that emerged from the boyar aristocracy of Muscovite Russia, that came to the throne following the turbulent time of troubles, that over the course of 3 centuries built Russia into one of the great European empires, that was ended by the Bolshevik Revolution and the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his family in 1918. But researchers have noted that certain things about the Romanov narrative are, at minimum, unusual. The time of troubles itself, the period of political crisis in Russia from approximately 1598 to 1613, during which there were multiple competing claimants to the throne, foreign invasions, famines, and widespread social disorder, is described in official history as a purely political crisis. But some researchers have pointed to evidence suggesting that the population disruptions of this period were more severe and more geographically widespread than a purely political crisis would typically produce. That something larger than a succession dispute may have been happening in the Eurasian interior during this period. And then, the Romanovs take the throne, and within a relatively short historical period, begin to systematically westernize Russia. Peter the Great's famous westernization project, which included not only the adoption of Western dress and customs and technology, but also the literal physical transformation of the country's capital city, St. Petersburg, constructed from nothing in the swamps of the Gulf of Finland. This project has been read by some researchers as something more than cultural modernization. It has been read as erasure. If the lands of Russia had been Tartaria, or part of Tartaria before the Romanov period, then Peter's systematic replacement of Russian Tatar cultural identity with a European one, his construction of a brand new capital designed from the ground up to look like a Western European city, his importation of Western architects and engineers and artists to fill that capital with Western-style buildings would be not just cultural aspiration, but active suppression of the prior civilization. And Catherine the Great, who followed Peter and continued his westernization project, was by birth a German princess. A German princess who became, through a series of events that historians still find somewhat extraordinary, the absolute ruler of the largest country on earth. A German princess who then proceeded to govern that country for 34 years, commissioning vast quantities of new construction, establishing new institutions, importing Western culture at an unprecedented rate. None of this proves anything about Tartaria. The official history of the Romanovs is rich and detailed and internally consistent. But the pattern of deliberate cultural overwriting, the systematic replacement of prior cultural identity with a new one, the importation of foreign architects to build in a new style, the construction of new cities as if the old ones don't count, is at least consistent with the idea that someone was trying to create the appearance of a civilization that sprang from European roots, rather than one that had inherited the cultural legacy of whatever had been there before. The grand exhibitions between approximately 1850 and 1915, the industrializing nations of the Western world engaged in an extraordinary and still somewhat puzzling tradition. The great world's fairs, the grand expositions, the international exhibitions, Crystal Palace in London in 1851, the 1867 Paris Exposition Universelle, the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, the 1889 Paris Exposition at which the Eiffel Tower was built, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the 1900 Paris Exposition, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. Each of these exhibitions involved the construction of enormous, elaborate complexes of buildings, often covering hundreds of acres, often featuring main buildings of such scale and grandeur that they would have been the largest public buildings in their host cities. And then, almost invariably, these buildings were demolished, torn down, removed. A very small number, like the Eiffel Tower, were retained. The vast majority were gone within a few years of the exhibition's closing. This is a pattern that, once you see it, is very difficult to unsee. What kind of civilization builds, at enormous expense, some of the most sophisticated structures in its history, displays them for a few years, and then tears them down? The official explanation is pragmatic. The buildings were temporary. They were made of materials that would not last. They were built on land that would be used for other purposes. The expense of maintaining them permanently was not justified by their ongoing utility. But researchers studying the actual construction of these buildings have noted that many of them were not, in fact, made of obviously temporary materials. The main buildings of many world's fairs were built of substantial materials: stone aggregate, cast iron, elaborate decorative work, that in other contexts would have been expected to last for centuries. And more to the point, why build something of such grandeur as a temporary structure? The aesthetic language of these exhibition buildings was not the aesthetic language of temporary structures. It was the aesthetic language of permanence, of civic pride, of civilization speaking its own enduring values into stone. Unless, researchers suggest, they weren't being built at all, unless they were being found. The Tartaria hypothesis proposes that many of the world's fair structures were not newly constructed for the exhibitions. They were, instead, repurposed buildings that already existed, structures from the previous civilization that had survived, partially intact, and that the new powers of the industrial age chose to use as exhibition venues. And when the exhibition was over, when the public had been given their carefully managed glimpse of splendor and wonder, the buildings were demolished. Not because they were temporary and had served their purpose, but because they needed to be removed before too many people started asking where they had really come from. If you have ever looked at photographs of the White City in Chicago, or of the main exhibition halls of the 1900 Paris Exposition, you may have felt something, a feeling that is hard to name, a sense that these structures belong to a different world than the world you know, that they have a quality of age and weight and presence that doesn't quite match the story of their rapid construction. That feeling may be information, it may be the intuition speaking, in the language of aesthetic recognition, the story that the official history has not chosen to tell. The hidden people. Any civilization leaves people. This is one of the simplest and most reliable principles in all of history. Even when civilizations are destroyed, conquered, collapsed, culturally overwritten, the people remain. Sometimes they are absorbed into the conquering culture. Sometimes they retreat to margins. Sometimes they preserve fragments of the previous world in language, in oral tradition, in the specific shapes of things they continue to build. If the Tartarian civilization was real, there should be people. Researchers in the Tartaria community have explored several directions in looking for them. One direction is the Roma people, historically called gypsies, a term now widely considered a slur. The Roma are a people with a documented origin in the Indian subcontinent, who migrated westward into Central Asia and eventually into Europe over a period beginning perhaps in the 11th or 12th century. Their route of migration aligns, in broad terms, with the territories that older maps labeled as Tartaria, and their cultural characteristics, their complex relationship with settled society, their preservation of distinct musical and artistic traditions, their historical role as craftspeople and metalworkers and traders are consistent with a people who were once part of something larger and who have been living in the margins of history since that something ended. Another direction is the many groups of people historically described as Tatars, not Tartars in the civilizational sense, but Tatars in the ethnic sense, the Turkic-speaking Muslim peoples who live primarily in Russia, Ukraine, Central Asia, and China. These groups have their own histories, their own languages, their own cultural traditions, and within those traditions, researchers have found fragments, architectural vocabulary that resonates with the Tartarian aesthetic, oral historical narratives that describe a world before the current world, place names and family names that preserve linguistic traces of something larger. A third direction is more speculative but compelling, the people who appear in historical documents as being displaced, relocated, or absorbed during the transition period. The populations of certain regions who show up in 19th century records as mysteriously reduced from their earlier documented numbers. The communities whose traditions of building and craft and cultural organization seem older and more sophisticated than the official history of their civilization